It's interesting, Human, that you mentioned sort of food security, and that came home to me after, I'm sure you remember the Ever Given, when Ever Given blocked
Oh, yeah.
the Suez Canal. And 6 weeks after that, or 5, 6 weeks after that, on a Friday evening, usually on a Friday evening, my family, I've got 4 grown-up kids, but whoever's around, we go out and have a meal somewhere. We've got about 4 or 5 restaurants we go to. On this Friday evening, I went out, I think I had my wife, 3 of the kids, went out to a Chinese restaurant. They know us very well. We've been going there for 20 years. Sat down, how's it going? Da, 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 da. Brought the crackers, everything nice. Ordered the food. Da, da, da. Tsingtao beer, please. Sorry, no Tsingtao. What do you mean you're a Chinese restaurant? Why no Tsingtao beer? Suez Canal blocked, no Tsingtao beer. And you suddenly realize that the Suez Canal being blocked has stopped my local Chinese restaurant having Tsingtao beer, because, of course, that's how it comes in. And it just brought home to me, if you look around us, if you literally go out of wherever you are now in the world and walk around wherever you are for 10 minutes, the amount of stuff that comes from somewhere else, not from where you are, is almost incalculable. One of the things I'm going to be talking about, or asking you to talk about, is this idea that one of the things we've seen since COVID is this idea of hyper-localization, that we have to bring our supply chains in much closer, almost within touching distance, because of the vulnerabilities around that. You mentioned that, Matt, and you're absolutely right. Of course, complexity creates resilience, but also because it avoids single points of failure, it creates multiple paths to success, but it also creates vulnerabilities. And anybody who has a background in the academic side of risk management knows, Perrow's idea of normal accidents, that once you get two complex organisms interconnecting, then the likelihood of failure is absolutely because we can't model that. So therefore, it is an inevitable systems level failure, which I think we're seeing. Before we move on, I'm going to ask everybody a question. Let's get some bit of audience participation. Can you please put in the chat just one word, either resilient or fragile? Do you think we are more resilient now than we were 10 years ago? Well, let's say 15 years ago. Let's go back to 2010. Are we more resilient now than we were in 2010, or are we more fragile? Having spent the last 15 years talking about resilience, let's see whether we've had an impact. So can you just put in the chat, please, wherever you are, where you think fragile. Okay. Fragile. Matt, given that we've been spending our lives trying to talk about resilience, why the hell is everybody up fragile? I mean, what happened? I mean, and that's a serious question.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And my instinctive response is to agree with everybody about that fragility and the precariousness that it feels like at the moment. But I did actually write resilient in the box, but didn't submit it. And the reason for that is I think often emergency managers, crisis experts, are programmed to be pessimistic and negative, but there is lots of good and there is lots of hope, and I think it's important that we don't lose sight of that. Yes, there's a lot more to be done, and as we've talked about, that sort of the uncertainty, the volatility, particularly in the sort of geopolitical space at the moment, that definitely fills us with amount of fear, for sure. But I think it's important we don't lose sight of all the brilliant work that has happened in that period. There is lots that's happened that has improved people's resilience, but there is a lot more to do, and we can be a bit more joined up in how we share some of those experiences. That would be my thoughts, David, I think.
What are your thoughts on that? Because, I mean, one of the things that you are supposed to be doing is helping cities become resilient, isn't it? I mean, that's part of what you do as an organization. Why is it that sort of 18 out of 20 people said fragile rather than resilient?
I think the fact that we acknowledge that we become fragile is actually a big step ahead. I think in the last couple of years, I don't think we were actually aware of the fragility of the system. I think COVID really brought that out. I think, to Matt's point, I do think that we are making strides now in a lot of parts of the world. I do think some countries are way ahead of others. Where I live in the UAE, for example, and I think we're still very fragile here. But I think the fact that we are acknowledging the fragility of the system and we are making steps towards it, I think that's a good thing. And I do think that the advances in technology in the past really made us focus on that, and we weren't focusing on, okay, what are the risks associated with being very connected globally. So I do think that there are things that are being done to support this, to support obviously our resilience as cities. But I still do think that over the last couple of decades as well, with technological advancements, we have really focused more on that and not realized that, okay, we still need to keep some things in-house. And, for example, manufacturing has been one of them. Once COVID hit and there were certain parts of the world where, you couldn't buy certain manufactured goods because it just couldn't be made in that country. And, the other countries were already using up the supply, or it was too difficult to move products across. But I do think we still are fragile, but we are improving, and we're acknowledging the fragility, and that cities are now taking steps to resolve that.
Thanks, Andrew. Andrew Blades, let's bring you from Australia. You put up there resilient as well. Andrew, do you want to come in and sort of talk about why you think we are more resilient?
Sure. David, as with most things, I take a historical perspective on so many things, and I'm hearing people talk about the last 2 decades.
Andrew, do you want to open up your camera, by the way?
I've got really bad internet tonight.
Fine.
We've got bad weather.
No.
And we talk about what happened in the last couple of decades, as opposed to let's look a lot longer than that. And you'll know that I will automatically default to the systems approach. We've built systems to exist in certain environments. Those environments have changed. So whether the system is suited to the new environment is, for me, not a question of fragility. It's a question of whether it's suited to the new environment. And therefore, should we have changed it as the environment started to change? That can be very difficult to do with an engineered system, but humans are remarkably good at changing what they do and how they do things. So certainly the Australian experience is things like heat. We've now got this wonderful thing called air conditioning down here. That's enabled us to look after our elderly as we're starting to experience a lot more heat. Now, there are other issues that flow with that, but when we start to look at some of these things, in some ways the system has become more resilient. The other thing is that the globalised system that we've sort of clung, or parts of the world have clung to over the last 3 decades, we've really encouraged specialisation. So when you encourage a country to specialise in a particular activity, like the growth of food so they can ship it to Africa as an example, then that's what it specialises in. So by default, it has made a choice to specialise in one thing rather than another, or that may have been forced upon it by a more significant power. I think the other thing is, one of the questions I always have is, when we talk about we are more resilient, who is we? It's very easy to take a European perspective of the world. Not all of us live in a European setting. Obviously, Australia's not in Europe, but we tend to have a more European view of the world than perhaps other countries do. So I think it's very easy to talk in generalities. It's a lot harder to start saying, okay, how do these systems work? Who's at play? Who's doing what? I think they're the questions that I often look at, and in some areas we are more resilient, in some areas we are less resilient. I'm not always sure that talking in the dichotomies of resilience and fragility is helpful. I think it's more helpful to talk about various scales of resilience. I would also note that, and we've had this discussion before, David, so I'm more than happy to step back into it again. If you have been trained as an ecologist in resilience, your world view on resilience is very different than if you've come from another setting. So a lot of this, I think, also depends on what your academic training is and your disciplines and your background. Whatever system you design, you're going to design problems into it, and normal accidents occur.
Normal accidents do occur. Pete, I bring you in about sort of when you say Pete Davis, and I note that you're sort of just on the sidebar today, but you talk about the fact that people, when you speak to people about 9/11, they look you slightly blank. And Matt, you responded to that you feel, that we have the responsibility to deal with that. Don't forget, that's 25 years ago. So when I'm in universities, that is before people were born. I remember when I was 7 or 8 years old, there was a series in the UK of magazines that came out about footballers, and I collected it every month. But they were talking about footballers from the 1950s. That was before I was born. I couldn't understand why they were talking. It was only 7 years previous to that. But anything that happens before you were born is ancient history. It doesn't matter how old you are. So I think that 25 years ago is a long time. That's a whole generation. I just want to read something out. I just looked up something. I want to read something out to you from here. Okay, this is from an academic paper. I'll give you the details afterwards. And I just want to know if you recognize this. 3 decades ago, there was not enough theoretical material or research work on response to social crises and disasters to have warranted more than a footnote attesting to that fact. A paragraph could have summarized all the relevant work and activity of 2 decades ago. Even 10 years ago, several pages might have sufficed to summarize totally the burgeoning activity in the area. The growth of the area has been exponential, not linear. And today, the research efforts and theoretical advances have reached such a level as to force us to be highly selective in our coverage in this paper. Andrew Blair's Quarantelli, very good. It was. Do you recognize that? Matt, do you recognize that sort of feeling that where the hell do I go for information? Because there's just so much information out there. It's overwhelming. Do you recognize that?
Yeah, definitely recognise that, and would probably add that there's something around how accessible that information is as well. It's often not available to practitioners, or it's sort of in obscure places. So there's more that perhaps can be done to bring some of that insight and the research work into the practitioner space to inform our work. That's something I mentioned. We work with UCL at the moment. It's something that we're keen to do, but we recognise that we're not hugely effective at doing that at the moment, and there's more we can do there to bring in those insights, and not just from the UK, but as others have said, from other global perspectives, recognising that London is a global city.